Okay, now we've got our project set up and we've got our layered images exported and ready to use in our comic. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of setting up the data files that define our comic. So here's the basic structure of a panels comic. A comic will have multiple sequences. A sequence is sort of like a chapter, and each sequence has a set of panels. It can have one panel or many panels. These panels are the frames that hold the individual drawings that we exported last time. And each panel can have multiple layers. Each layer contains an image or some text, and we can define properties for each layer to control the positioning within the panel, the parallax movement as the panel scrolls, and other effects like animation and opacity. This all ends up being a lot of stuff to define for a whole comic. So to keep things organized, I like to split this up so I have a separate file for each sequence in my comic. So let's do that now. So I'm going to create a new folder in my project to hold all my data files. I'll call that folder comicData. And inside that folder, I'll create a new file for my first sequence. The first thing I need to do in this file is define my sequence table. In Lua, we use curly braces to create a table, and I'll assign this table to a variable called S01 for sequence 1. Before I start adding anything specific to this sequence, I'm just going to stub out the structure that we just talked about. So I have a sequence, and in my sequence, I have a list of panels. It's important to note here that the variable I use for my sequence doesn't matter. That's just something I'm making up. But the property names that I use inside my sequence need to match what the panels library expects. So this list of panels needs to be specifically named panels. And this panels table is just a list, which is similar to an array in other languages. So the individual panels don't have property names. I just create a comma-separated list of the items inside. One item for each panel in my sequence. And each panel has a layers property that is, again, just a list of unnamed items, one for each layer in the panel. So most of the time, each layer is going to display a single image. So I'll create a series of layers here like I did in the last video, one image per layer. And again, the layers go back to front. So my background layer goes first, and then the one in front of that, and the one in front of that. And remember, the path I use here for my images is relative to the images folder in my project. And I'll go ahead and add a parallax property to each of these layers so we get some depth effects. Remember, the farther away something is, the higher its parallax value should be. And in this first panel, I also want to have a text layer. So I could have exported my text as an image and brought it in like these other layers. That would work fine, but I actually want to use an effect on my text to have it type on, so I'll keep it as live text. Text layers work just like any other layer, except instead of specifying an image, I specify the text that I want to appear. I also need to set the position for the text layer. That position's relative to the top left of my panel, and I'll also give it a parallax value. And since I want this text to stand out against the drawing behind it, I'm going to give it a solid black background. Before I can test this panel, I need to make a change to my project because if I look in my main file, I'm still importing this my comic data file from the project template, but I don't want to use that anymore because I just created my own new file. So I'm going to delete these lines. But now what should I use for my comic data? What should be getting sent to panels when I start the comic? Obviously, I want to import this new file I made. It's in a folder called comicData, so I just need to make sure to include that in the path. And the sequence inside that file is called S01, so I can reference that in my main file now that I have that imported. But remember, panels is expecting this comicData table to represent a list of all the sequences in my comic. And the file I just made only represents a single sequence, the first sequence. So what I'm going to do is create a new table here in my main file. I'll call it comicData. And inside that table, I'm going to list all the individual sequences that I import from their own separate files. So right now I only have one, but as I add more, I'll import them and add them to this comicData table. Now, you don't have to do it this way. I like to do it this way because it keeps things more organized to just have a single sequence in each file. But if it works better for you to keep everything all in one huge file, you can do that. That's how this file in the template is set up, so you could just keep using that if you like. I don't like that, so I'm gonna get rid of this file. And now if I test this, I can see my comic is using that new panel I just set up. So panels gives me some sensible default settings for my comic. Without having to specify anything at all, I get a side-scrolling comic with borders and margins on a white background. But I can customize all of that if there's something I want to change. So let's go back to my sequence file. The first thing I'll do is give this sequence a title. This title is what will appear in the chapters menu in my game. So if you don't give your sequence a title, then it won't appear in the chapter menu at all. And you might actually want to do that if you have multiple sequences that thematically belong to the same chapter in your story. In that case, then you can name the first chapter and leave the other sequences that go with that chapter unnamed. That sort of groups them all under the name of the first sequence. The two other main settings that I can change on the sequence itself are the scroll direction and the scroll type. So scroll direction just determines if I want this sequence to scroll left to right, or right to left, or vertically, top down, or bottom up. By default, I get a left to right horizontally scrolling comic, but I can change it to top-down scrolling by changing the direction property on the sequence. Changing this to top-down scrolling will give me a vertically scrolling sequence. You can see all my positioning and parallax scrolling in my panel still works, even though I'm scrolling in the other direction now. If you're not sure what values to use for this, you can find all the options in the panel's documentation. The other big thing you might want to change is the scroll type. That just means, do I scroll this manually with the crank and the D-pad, or do the panels scroll automatically each time I press a button? So I can set the scroll type to auto. And now I can automatically jump between the panels by pressing the D-pad. If you're going to use this kind of auto-scrolling, then it's a good idea to include some kind of graphic in your panels that indicates that the user needs to press a button to advance. Otherwise, they might not know what to do. So you can do that by adding something to your drawing, adding a layer to this panel, or by enabling a setting at the panel level to show a button indicator. So there are a couple other settings you can change for a sequence, like changing the background color from white to black, or changing the advance button that appears at the end of the sequence. You can refer to the documentation for those settings. But as I just mentioned, you can also change some settings at the panel level. So the things I'm setting up here apply to this entire sequence. But I can also come into any one of my panel objects and change things here. So let's first look at that advance control indicator button since I was just talking about it. First, I need to tell panels that I want to show that graphic in this panel. And I also need to position it within the panel. I'll put mine somewhere in the top left. And I can also change which button I want to advance from this panel to the next. So instead of using the D-pad, which is the default, I can specify to use the A button. So now the user can see that they need to press the A button to advance this panel. But since I'm only setting that setting on the panel itself, it only applies to that first panel. So I'd still need to go through and set those settings on the other panels in my sequence if I wanted to do that. And that does seem kind of repetitive, but most of the time I find I want to position this in different places to work with the drawings in each of the panels anyway. So it's not overlapping or interfering with what's in the panel. Anyway, I'm going to remove all of that because I actually want this to be a manually scrolling sequence that scrolls from left to right. But I do want to change something about this sequence. To see that, let me first add the rest of the layers to these other panels. So I've got all my layers in now for this first sequence. And I can see that this second panel doesn't look right. The drawing for this panel is actually much wider than the Playdate screen, but the default setting is to make each panel full screen with a little bit of margin. So I'm not seeing my full drawing here, and stuff is sort of weirdly getting cut off. So to make this wider, I need to adjust the frame property for this second panel. So frame is a table where I can set the width and the height of the frame. I can also change the margin around the edge of the frame and the gap between this frame and the one that comes after it. But in this case, I'm only interested in changing the width. The defaults for everything else are fine, so I can just only specify what I want to change and it will get those defaults for everything else. And now I can see I have that nice wide panel to scroll through for the second panel. So I've got this sequence looking pretty good. I've got all my images and layers imported for the entire sequence. So I'll go ahead and quickly add a second sequence just so we can repeat that process and get familiar with it. So I'll create a new file in my comicData folder for sequence 2. I'll create a new sequence in this file in a variable called S02. Inside I'll add 2 panels and I'll just paste over the image layers for each of those 2 panels. This second sequence is where my character climbs down a ladder into the seed vault in his space station, so I want this to be a vertical sequence that scrolls top down. And I have another oversized panel here, but this time I need to change the height of this frame instead of the width. And I'm not going to set a title for this sequence because I feel like this conceptually belongs with the first sequence. It's sort of part of that same intro. It has to be a separate sequence technically because it's using a different scroll direction. But I think thematically it's part of that same chapter. So again, by omitting the title, this won't appear in my chapter's menu. And now to add this new sequence to my comic, I'll go back to my main file, import the file, and then add the sequence table to my list of sequences here. Remember, this is what's getting sent to panels when we start the comic. And now when I test this, if I go to my chapters menu, I can see we only have that one chapter to select from so far. But if I scroll through this first sequence, it automatically takes me to the second sequence that has vertical scrolling. So that pretty much covers the basics of setting up sequences, panels, and layers. And in the next couple videos, we'll look at adding enhancements like animation, audio, and special effects.